Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. I found some more videos that explain the prosecutor's fallacy, I think a little better. And I think as this layers on, we can understand more and more. And let's see. And we will also be able to understand more about what's going on with this octillion statistic in the Brian Koberger case. The defense does state that it is misleading and that it is the prosecutor's fallacy. And we learned last time that the prosecutor's fallacy is when you confuse two different statistics. And so, all right, let me just set up the video. Give me just a second. Let me just set up the video. Give me a second. All right.
And for a random jury, if you just start throwing numbers like 1 in a million at them, you know it'll be easy to make them think that it means one thing when it really means something else. Okay, for the people saying we need to chill with the statistics, let's look at a story that involves murder and DNA profiling. Usually DNA analysis is a done deal for people. When they hear, oh, they found John's DNA on this murder weapon, you don't really question that. But how do we know it's John's DNA? Yes, everyone's DNA is unique, and if we knew the exact letter sequence of someone's DNA, we could identify them with no question. But that isn't feasible to do right now. So for DNA profiling, while there are many methods, we'll discuss a graph known as an electropherogram, which I know so little about, but here's what the literature says. These display genetic loci. Humans have millions of these pairs you see that are all situated at different points along a horizontal axis. However, there are certain 13 that are of particular interest because they differ more between different people. For the animations here, I just put 13 single spikes rather than 13 pairs because they're just one empty room. But if you pick 2 people and looked at those 13 pairs for each of them, it's basically a guarantee they wouldn't all be in the same spot on that horizontal axis. Some might, but not all of them. In fact, it turns out, on average, for any one locus pair, there's roughly a 7.5% chance that it will be found in the same horizontal location for 2 given people. So if you had a DNA profile and just knew the location of one pair of peaks, and you knew Bob has peaks at the same location, that does not mean Bob is your guy, because about 1 in every 13 people will have peaks also at this location. But these are independent, so the chance 2 people have 2 pairs in the same locations is about 0.56%. For all 13 locations, it comes out to 1 in about 100 trillion. As in, given a full set of these 13 pairs and 100 trillion hypothetical people lined up, actually more, you probably find 1 match. Now, if you find that Bob is a match, let's say, you basically know he's the only match and a prime suspect, since, well, 100 trillion is well beyond the number of people that have ever existed on this planet. But still, it is probability. Now time for the murder story that I'm going to keep it real short. In December of 1972, a nurse named Diana Sylvester, that's the 3rd nurse in this video, came home from work after an all-night shift. Soon after her landlord heard oddly loud noises from upstairs. She went to investigate, and when she got to the room, a man was standing there in the doorway who apparently said, "Go away, we're making love." And he said it in an aggressive manner. The landlord was still suspicious, so they went to call the police, and when the police showed up, they found Diana Sylvester dead beneath a lit Christmas tree. There was DNA evidence that was gathered, but at this time, DNA profiling wasn't available. So all the police could do was go off of the landlord's description of the man, which would be these here. From this, the police were able to convict no one, and the case went cold for 30 years until 2003, when DNA profiling was available, and law enforcement got the funding to use these techniques on old, unsolved cases. And with this, they found a match. One match named John Puckett. This guy had previously been convicted of rape years ago, and although old now, past photos show that he matched all those descriptions given by the landlord 30 years earlier. Seems like a guaranteed conviction, but there were 2 problems. One, the DNA sample they used had been degraded. So of those 13 pairs we need to analyze for a basically guaranteed match, we only had a few. And on top of that, there was research going on that the 7.5% figure was in fact very wrong. Yes, DNA profiling has been questioned a lot, and here's the reason why. If there's a 7.5% chance 2 people share a certain pair of those genetic spikes, then the chance 2 people share 9 of them is 1 in 13 billion. As in, given 9 of these pairs, you can expect 1 in 13 billion people have exactly those in the same locations. The problem was there was a recent study done in which, of a sample of 60,000 people looking at 9 of those locus pairs, and that's any 9 of the 13 on file for each person, they found 90 matches. 90 matches out of 60,000 people. Shouldn't it be 1 in 13 billion? There's got to be something wrong, which is why they thought the 7.5% was incorrect, except it's not at all. If the 1 in 13 billion figure is correct, which heavy research suggested, then the expected matches would be 98 in a sample of 60,000 people. The study was pretty on par with expectation. So how does 1 in 13 billion translate to 90 matches in a group of 60,000? Well, the same way that a 1 in 365 chance of having some similarity, like a birthday, translates to a very possible 1 match in a group of just 23. In both cases, the question comes down to pairs of people and how many share any birthday or DNA profile, not a specific one. See, if you were given a single DNA profile with those 9 pairs, like that from a murder scene, and said, what is the chance someone in this group is a match? That is like asking, if I were given some date, what is the chance a person has that birthday? Now the probability is much lower because you're looking for something specific. It's going to take many more people before you're likely to find that given birthday or DNA profile. So a match is more meaningful. Just finding any match among 2 or more people is more likely because there are way more comparisons that have to be made, everyone to one another, rather than everyone to just one desired target. So think about it like this. You may find a birthday match in a group of 20.
Oh, you should totally start your own YouTube channel. And I hear the best advice is to just start. And oh, hello, Diane. Oh, it's so good to see you. And the best advice is just to start. And I did that. I just started. I was like, I kind of look cute in this light, and then I recorded a video on my couch for my first video. And I was like, oh, this isn't like that bad. And it gets easier every time. And you can YouTube those videos like YouTube after 40 or YouTube for retirement, and it's all of these reasons why you should. It is such a great experience. So you can grow as a person. There's so much to learn. I had to learn about like which mic to get, how the sound works, and like every time I get better and better with this StreamYard. It's really like a personal kind of goal that's really exciting, and it's fun, and I get to talk to all of you. So I highly recommend, if you want to start your own YouTube channel, do it. Don't hesitate. But it's good. Heather Fitzgerald, oh my gosh, it's so good to see you. Welcome. I'm going to put the video back on.
3 people. And you may find several matches in a group of like 50. But that does not change how rare it is for someone to have any given birthday. It's 1 in 365.
Welcome, everyone.
So using that reasoning, we may find 90 matches in this group of 60,000 from all the pairs that exist. But that does not change how rare it is for someone to have a specific set of 9 genetic loci, which, yes, comes out to 1 in about 13 billion people. So these researchers defending the accused murderer said, hey, our understanding of DNA profiling is actually wrong. How else could there be 90 matches? But really, these numbers were all accurate. It was the birthday paradox and analyzing pairs that they overlooked. Okay, so the numbers are correct, meaning John Puckett is looking more guilty, but there weren't 9 of those pairs, unfortunately, in the actual DNA sample. There were only 5, plus a few others whose magnitude was extremely low, so we couldn't make a super confident match on those. Now with basically 5 pairs, the probability comes out to about 1 in a million people having these same 5. We've seen this before, though. 1 in a million isn't much when considering everyone in the world. If 1 in a million people have those 5 pairs, even in a country of 300 million, yes, this was in the US, you'd find hundreds of matches. So instead of a 1 in a million chance of him being innocent, there's not even a 1% chance of him being guilty. There are hundreds of other people you could gather that would all have the same DNA profile. You guys see how chaotic this can get? We can't just ignore the stats, especially since DNA profiling is essentially statistics. But it's so easy for people to get lost in these numbers. They did look beyond all this, though. They realized, yes, John Puckett was the right age, was previously a convicted rapist, had all those descriptions, and matched at least 5 of the 13 site locations. So you watching this video right now, some, maybe many of you, are saying, oh my God, convict this guy, he's guilty. And what you're doing is basically just statistics. You're saying, what are the odds there happens to be another guy that aligns so perfectly with all that data? You might not have a number, but it's not 100% confidence. And there isn't some percentage that is required for a conviction to be made. But unless we know for sure it's this guy, which we don't, you're making a decision based on probability, whether you know the actual numbers or not. From what I read, this man could be innocent. Doesn't seem likely to me, but I didn't read about a confession or whatever. But he was convicted and sent to jail. Now, all these cases aren't a matter of what is right and wrong to do. I don't think there is really a right answer regarding how to use numbers in courts, besides use them correctly. And there's a reason we have to prove people are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. You'll find there's rarely a 100% chance that someone is guilty. Even with Ted Bundy, people had their doubts. And unfortunately, this means that occasionally innocent people will be sent to prison. We can't always be sure. But if we required 100% certainty, then most murderers and rapists would be set free. The thing we can take away from this, though, is that it is important for people to know it's okay to question numbers and be cautious of taking them at face value, because often there is some other meaning very much hidden beneath the surface. Now, being more exposed to these kinds of problems and getting hands-on practice with statistical reasoning and probability is definitely the best way to become more comfortable with all the numbers you come across every day, which is why I'm happy to have Brilliant as a sponsor of this video. Brilliant actually has a few courses that relate to what we saw here. Like one would be their Applied Probability course that covers a variety of probability concepts and shows you how they're put to use.
So that was Zach Starr. I recommend watching this video. It's linked in the comments, and it's called "Does Math Belong in the Courtroom?" And he has an excellent example at the end there where he he finds that in a population of 20,000, it is possible to have 98 people that have the same DNA profile, that it's not always what you see. And we will learn more about why it's not always what you see, because this next video is by True Allele. They actually are that genotyping software that we learned about in, I think, the Alabama lawyer who was talking about the NIST study where NIST sent DNA mixtures to the labs across the country. And they found that even within the same lab, the analysts all had varying answers, whether it was inclusive, exclusive, or non-conclusive, whether you can include the suspect, exclude the suspect, and that kind of thing. So there is lots of the interpretation is kind of derails the whole gold standard of what we think of DNA. So in that article, the Alabama attorney was talking about True Allele, which is the software, even though they will be speaking on the American Academy of Forensic Scientists. This is in Las Vegas in 2016. I'm going to show two of their videos, but the next video coming up is from 2022. So that one is a little newer, but this one, it is a little older, but the biases that they talk about for these are still true. And I know that I also thought of something else, that the reason why the state says it's a single source profile, maybe because they found a match in a database for Brian's profile. But even so, I think it's important to learn about the different types of biases, even if you are looking at a mixture, because some of it could cross over. So I'm going to hit play here.
Overcoming bias in DNA mixture interpretation. Forensic DNA identification is presumed to be neutral. Many think it stands for does not advocate for one side or the other. As such, DNA is the gold standard of forensic science. But the National Academy of Sciences report, the NAS report in 2009, which pointed out many problems with forensic analysis, including bite marks, hair analysis, bullet analysis, fingerprints, did note that there may be problems with how the DNA was interpreted, such as when there are mixed DNA samples. Professor Bill Thompson has written about the Texas sharpshooter fallacy in forensic DNA interpretation. That's where the target is painted around wherever the bullet actually is, rather than trying to get the bullet in a neutral target in the first place. And he's described how the bias of knowing what the answer is supposed to be, the DNA profile, can shift the DNA match target to a desired biased result.
I'm sorry.
His paper describes a low-level DNA profile that could admit several interpretations. And when DNA analysts were shown profiles after the fact, they could account for how virtually every Tom, Dick, and Harry might be included in this profile. And so by looking at the profile of a defendant during interpretation of DNA evidence, this led to bias and post hoc justifications that might incorrectly include innocent individuals.
I know, right?
E.D.L. Jor and Greg Hempikian have also written about subjectivity and bias in forensic DNA mixture interpretation.
That's the first time I've heard.
They reported some empirical data that suggested that DNA mixture interpretation is subjective. When the original two DNA analysts examined mixture data with case context, as shown in red, they both included
what do
However,
I do with that
subsequently,
step in the
in the
DNA?
study,
I'm sorry,
when
I'm not
17
sure
similarly
what
trained
you're asking me what
DNA
I did
analysts
with
were shown the identical DNA mixture data, this time without the context or knowing the answer. Only one of the 17 included the individual. 12, the vast majority, excluded the defendant, and 4 found the DNA mixture to be inconclusive. And this suggested that case context could have a major impact on the conclusions in DNA mixture interpretation. A DNA mixture arises when two or more people contribute their DNA to the same sample. In this example, we show how genotypes are combined. A genotype is the pair of alleles that an individual has at a genetic location. There are two alleles, one inherited from the person's mother and one inherited from their father. So here we see how a first genotype, which has a short tandem repeat or STR allele of length 10 and length 12, is combined with a second genotype at that locus, having allele 11 and allele 12. And these two genotypes, 1012 plus 1112, can be combined in the same sample to produce data that has peaks, as shown on the right, that have alleles 10, 11, and 12. More than two alleles, suggesting that there's at least two people present. The heights of the peaks suggest the quantities of DNA. This is an oversimplified diagram that leaves out many of the known artifacts and vagaries of the data. Interpreting DNA evidence proceeds in two steps. The first is to separate the mixture data into the genotypes of each of the contributors. Shown here is some data on the left, and now it's separated into two genotypes at this locus. The first genotype lists 6 allele pairs, each with some probability. The reason is that from the population, there may be as many as 100 possible allele pairs, but the data constrains what the genotype can be, limits the possibilities, thereby producing identification information. And it's usually not expected to have only one genotype value on the list, but rather a list of more than one possibility with associated probabilities. In this example, the probabilities associated with each of the two contributors are different, with more probability weighted on 1012 in the first genotype and more on 1112 in the second genotype. And this separation unmixes the DNA mixture. The second step of DNA mixture interpretation is to compare a separated genotype at a genetic locus with a known reference standard. Here we see how 1112 is the standard, and that selects out from the list the 1112 with 40% probability, shown for the second genotype. A match statistic is the ratio of the probability of this specific match with the evidence divided by the probability of coincidence. Here we see on the bottom that it's 40% in the numerator, that the evidence has a genotype with an 1112 value, and the denominator has a, say, 4% chance of seeing the 1112 in the population by coincidence. This ratio of 40% divided by 4% is 10, which is the match statistic at this locus. Notice that if all the probability had been 100%, we would have had a higher match statistic of 100 over 4, or 25. Cognitive bias occurs when illogical thinking affects decisions. There are many sources of cognitive bias, and here we'll focus on just two. In confirmation bias, the interpretation of evidence confirms one's initial belief. Oversimplification is a bias where simplicity trumps accuracy, and so data or interpretation may be modified for the purpose of simplicity instead of getting the correct answer. With contextual bias, background information affects decisions. There are, again, many types of contextual bias, and here are two of particular importance in forensic science. There's a motivational bias to reach a desired outcome. This may be because of one's employer or the importance of a case or the role of an analyst in a case, getting the bad guy or excluding the good guy. There's also a social desirability bias, which is to want to be seen positively. For example, to want to help in convicting someone who may be considered guilty, or in not being ripped apart on cross-exam because of a lack of understanding of DNA evidence. Let's look at 5 different sources of bias in DNA mixture interpretation. First is data bias, where analysts discard evidence based on other cognitive or contextual information they may have. For example, shown on left is a mixture with peaks that are lower at 10, increasing up to 12. An analyst may subjectively decide that the 10 peak is very small and it represents stutter, which is a copying artifact in the data, and as shown here by turning the peak white, just discards the data altogether and says it's not there. Alternatively, they may apply a threshold. This is very common with the older methods of the last 15 years. A red line, shown here, is drawn through the data, and any peaks that are underneath that data are just thrown out and not used in DNA mixture interpretation, even though you can obviously see them. So here, the 10 and the 12 peak are just gone. They're not used, and only the peak over 12 is present, and often analysts won't even use the peak. They'll just say it's in there.
So we'll never
Lastly, locus may not support a conclusion, or it may be too ambiguous for an analyst to use, and so all the data is thrown out. The locus is completely gone, often having seen the DNA profile of a defendant. The decision's made, let's not use this data. A genotype bias occurs when the actual genotype, the probability distribution, is transformed into something else that's more desirable, maybe because it's simpler or maybe because it helps reach a particular conclusion. Here we see how different genotype possibilities with one main possibility at 1012 with 75% probability is just converted into a 1012 because the analyst chooses one genotype to simplify the problem. This is done in the random match probability, or RMP, mixture interpretation method. And the result is to inflate the DNA match statistic by putting 100% weight in the numerator instead of only the 75% that scientifically belongs there. There is also a match bias in DNA mixture interpretation that occurs at the level of calculating a statistic. With a combined probability of inclusion, or CPI, an analyst begins by first including the suspect, having already modified the data. CPI has an unrealistic, unproven model, and as shown in the paper above, published in the Journal of Pathology Informatics, CPI is a random number generator that lacks probative value. Even with likelihood ratios, or LRs, an analyst can ignore much of the data. The calculation in the end does require a suspect genotype. Many of these LR methods introduce phantom peaks that have evidence not even present in the data using dropout models, and they typically consider very few of the genotype possibilities out of everything that could be a genotype. There's a process bias in much mixture interpretation done by people. The first step shown on the left is that an analyst can subjectively choose, alter, discard, edit, or manipulate the DNA signals. That's routine in current interpretation. Secondly, having manipulated the data, they then compare a defendant's genotype to this edited data and decide if the defendant's in the DNA evidence. As shown on the right in blue, only if the person is included in the manipulated data will they even calculate a DNA mixture statistic. What's wrong with this is that the hidden cognitive and contextual biases largely determine the DNA match statistic outcome, and these are hidden from the judge, the jury, or any description of the process in the report. Instead, they're presented as unbiased DNA identification science. There's also a software bias in why labs choose their DNA mixture interpretation software.
Almost impossible.
Here are some reasons we hear of. The software can put an analyst in charge or get results that confirm their expert beliefs. But this is just confirmation bias and shouldn't be in the software at all. The software can simplify the DNA problem by removing many possibilities and use less of the data. That's an oversimplification bias. The software can help them get a desired answer by letting them manipulate thresholds, parameters, dropout values, and so on. Well, that introduces motivational bias in this ostensibly objective software. Here are other reasons. The FBI uses it, or it fits right into my familiar current process. Now, that's a social desirability bias that has nothing to do with objective.
This one made me laugh. The one down here that says the FBI uses it, I feel like that's Brett Payne's response. So, like, all of his questions. Well, the FBI, the FBI did it. So, the answers for the DNA is going to be, well, the FBI did whatever work you're asking for, so we don't have anything to do with it not matching. The FBI uses it. That's one of the major biases in this case.
Objective, accurate science. How can lawyers keep biased DNA evidence out of the courtroom? One is to make it inadmissible by filing and getting approval for a motion to suppress based on relevance, or the Federal Rules of Evidence 403. The idea of this, as shown on the left, is that evidence makes a fact more or less probable, but the probative value of DNA is often greatly inflated in DNA match statistics. On the right side, we see that Rule 403 says that evidence can be excluded if it's substantially outweighed by a danger of unfair prejudice or other factors like confusing the issues or misleading the jury. And that's what we have with DNA. Just saying the word DNA, do not acquit, means the introduction of unfair prejudice if, in fact, the DNA really doesn't have the probative value that the proffer of the evidence claims that it does.
If this
in the
DNA
cross-examination
really match,
of
Brian,
an expert DNA witness, hundreds of effective questions can be asked that will elicit bias. For example, one can ask, did you know the defendant's genotype during your analysis of the evidence? This is usually true, and you can explore different variations of that to determine how it might have been used during mixture interpretation. Also, following up, doesn't knowing your customer's desired answer, your motivational bias, affect your decisions? They could say yes or no, but the point is being made. Finally, along this thread, have any scientific studies demonstrated otherwise? Well, no, of course not. But either they don't know about them or you do know about some, and you're bringing out the possibility of bias by having looked at the answer in front of the jury. Sequential unmasking has been proposed as a way of reducing bias in human DNA review of mixtures. The idea is to first have a human analyze the crime scene data without knowing the case context or DNA profile references, and only then afterwards make comparisons of what's been elicited from the data relative to these reference samples. But there's still potential human bias in how people choose the data, how they conduct the mixture analysis, and how they make the comparisons. Human analysts can always introduce bias. So why is a human even involved in the process? Why not use an unbiased computer instead? An unbiased interpretation can be done by using an objective computer to first examine all the DNA data without having a suspect's genotype. Secondly, separate genotypes of each DNA mixture contributor, considering all possible allele pair solutions for each of the contributors. And thirdly, compare genotypes only afterwards, only after the genotypes have been separated, to calculate match statistics. Using an objective computer in this way eliminates all human involvement to overcome cognitive and contextual bias in DNA mixture interpretation. An objective computer removes data bias by using all the evidence. There are no peak choices. A computer with a Bayesian model learns stutter from the evidence. There are no thresholds that can be played with. Instead, a computer can have a rich Bayesian model that models variation directly from the DNA mixture evidence. And there are no locus choices if you're using...
Yeah. So, Heather, it's very convenient that a lot of the people who want to believe Brian is guilty that he wanted to commit the perfect crime. It's just too, what do you call it? Simplistic. It's too easy. It doesn't work.
All the loci all the time. With an objective computer, there's no genotype bias. Whatever the separated genotype for a contributor looks like as a probability distribution at a locus is what's actually used. And what's desired is to use the actual genotype probability and not having a person change the probability to make things simpler or lead to a desired conclusion. Match bias can be eliminated by using accurate calculations for the statistics. The CPI method should never be used. It's just a random number generator, bad forensic science. And in fact, it's been used in hundreds of thousands of cases, and honestly, all of them need to be reviewed again to look for potentially exculpatory evidence where this method failed. With likelihood ratios, there are many different versions and software programs, but whatever the calculation is, should not ignore any of the data. It can't use suspect genotypes. It shouldn't use methods that concoct phantom peaks that aren't even present in the data, and it must use all genotype possibilities, not just the obvious few. To eliminate process bias, remove the analyst from the process. Then first, a human can't change the data signals based on things they...
Diane, did you watch Yollie? You know Yollie, the attorney? She has her own channel. I should link it. Oh, hello, Twiz. She talks about, well, she goes over the Pennsylvania press releases and how they describe their tactical force on how they arrested Brian. And it sounds like they surrounded the house and Brian's parking lot. Yeah. Yes, Yollie is wonderful. I love her too. Let's see. Yeah. Well, if you don't have it, you should check her out. Let me see if I can. I should have her right up front. Well, I'll still let this video go.
They've heard. Secondly, the human analyst can't use a defendant genotype that they may have seen because if they're not in the process, steps 1 and 2 are gone. We've eliminated cognitive and contextual bias from the process. Now we're only left with 3, shown in blue on the right, calculating an accurate DNA mixture statistic, and not saying anything that is biased, and just presenting unbiased science in reports and in testimony.
Here it is.
To eliminate software bias, only
Yo Law.
Calculators that produce true DNA match statistics should be used. These results must be accurate, giving the correct answer. Objective, not letting extraneous information in. Thorough, using all the data, considering all possibilities, deriving it from the data, not from preconceptions or calibrations. And validated, fit for purpose on the data to which it's being applied. The extraneous factors for choosing software, like making the analyst feel good about themselves or because the FBI likes it, are not factors. Rather, a process should be used with accurate software that examines all the data without human choice, separates genotypes, considers all solutions, and compares genotypes, letting the match statistic decide the outcome, not human prejudices, bias, or preconceived notions. Cybergenetics true allele mixture interpretation technology was designed to meet all of these unbiased criteria. You can learn more about it by visiting Cybergenetics' website, where there are courses, newsletters, articles, and talks, or by visiting our YouTube channel. Thank you.
All right, I do have one more video. Yes, this one. This one is very interesting, especially Heather, since you picked up, you were talking about how it's a partial and it will never be full and we'll never know the complete full profile for it to match anybody. This video here is interesting. I don't know if it relates to the Brian Koberger case at all, but I just thought this is very almost philosophical, and I don't know if I was on a jury on a spot and if somebody was trying to explain this to me, it might be hard to unravel that there is evidence that appears to be forensic DNA evidence, but it has no forensic value. But sometimes the attorneys still want to attach a statistic to it. they find some type of reason where they can do that. So even if there is an inconclusive result and somehow the state has circular reasoning about how it still should have a statistic, that is very confusing, because if there just isn't forensic value there, I don't know why it's even allowed in court. So again, I don't know if this particular video relates to the Brian Koberger case, but I think it's very interesting. I'd like to know what you all think about this one. This one is so different. I've never heard anybody explain this to me before.
I will be talking about making something out of nothing, the inconclusive fallacy.
Here you
How
go.
is it
Heather, it's
that
dedicated to
uninformative
you.
forensic
You know
evidence
nothing.
can be turned into something that looks probative? It's well known that nothing comes of nothing. The first law of thermodynamics and science basically says you can't get something for nothing. In mathematics, the logical foundation of arithmetic and the natural numbers includes 0 plus 0 equals 0. And William Shakespeare wrote in King Lear that nothing will come of nothing. So how could it be any different in forensic science and law? How can it be that no evidence implies guilt? Well, some lawyers argue that the absence of forensic evidence implies guilt. They do this by arguing that inconclusive DNA evidence means the defendant is included in the DNA evidence. This argument is fallacious, wrong, and dangerous.
Dangerous. Do you like how
In
he said that?
practice, it generally starts with a written conclusion in a lab report. On the slide, you'll see some examples of what the language might look like. Due to the potential number of contributors and low-level results, no conclusions will be made regarding this DNA profile. Or, another example, due to the limited amount of information obtained, the comparison between the defendant and this DNA mixture is inconclusive. As discovery provided to opposing counsel, this wouldn't be seen as damaging or inculpatory. Should be end of the story.
Should be into this story. Exactly, Heather. And I think how Bill Thompson he wrote that protective order for the IGG very confusing. It is very reminiscent of how the PCA is written. This argument here is very reminiscent of both of those documents. I wouldn't be surprised if Bill Thompson uses a very confusing argument like this one. So yes, in the absence of all Payne's evidence that he doesn't have, never had the source material to create the map or make any of those allegations. So here it is. This is what Bill Thompson's going to do, because he's the math is Palter, is that how you say it? He has a certain way with confusing reality. Here it is.
At trial, however, the proffering attorney then introduces this inconclusive result through their expert. The expert confirms that the testing is inconclusive or that no conclusions can be drawn. The attorney then goes further and has their expert agree that based on these inconclusive or no conclusion results, the defendant cannot be excluded from the DNA evidence. In closing arguments, the lawyer either implies or explicitly tells the jury that since the defendant cannot be excluded, he must be included in the DNA evidence and therefore is guilty as charged. The attorney provides a narrative of guilt not supported by science. The lawyer has transformed nothing into incriminating evidence. This logical fallacy misapplies the law of the excluded middle. The lawyer is incorrectly saying that the defendant must either be excluded or included from the evidence. There is no other possibility. This is shown in the boxes on the slide in blue. But there is a third possibility. The evidence is inconclusive, shown in the box in red, and so no excluded or included determination can be made. Lawyers and jurors do not sit well with this. We like things binary, true, false, guilty, not guilty. But the reality is, even in our jurisprudence, there is a third possibility: guilty, not proven. We must ensure that scientific testimony and evidence is relevant and reliable. Here, there is too large an analytical gap between the inconclusive result and the inference of guilt.
Forensic scientists obtain identification information from DNA evidence. They do this by examining the evidential support for a hypothesis and its alternative. The hypothesis is typically that the defendant is included in the DNA item. The alternative is the opposite, that the defendant is excluded from the DNA evidence. Scientists use computers to balance this evidence from the DNA data. On the left, we see that there could be evidence support for a person being included. That's the hypothesis. On the right, the balance scales are showing the degree of evidence support for the alternative, that the defendant is excluded. And sometimes these balances equal, and there's equal weight for both the hypothesis of inclusion and the alternative of exclusion. The data support for included and excluded are equal. In that case, the likelihood ratio, this balancing of the evidential support of hypothesis and alternative, equals 1. A zero match statistic implies zero information. The standard additive measure of information in science is the logarithm of the likelihood ratio. The logarithm of the LR measures information. When that likelihood ratio equals 1, then the logarithm of the number 1 equals 0. The log LR is 0, and the evidence has 0 information. So there is 0 information about inclusion or exclusion. 0 is not a positive log LR that supports inclusion. 0 is not a negative log LR that supports exclusion. A 0 log LR means a 0 match statistic, which means 0 information. In forensic science, informative DNA evidence often goes unreported. Many crime labs do all the work of their DNA analysis, and then they do the statistical analysis and make comparisons, and they obtain likelihood ratio value.
Take note here, it says exclusionary LR of 1 in 1,000. Just keep that
Yes,
front
that
of your
are
mind.
important information for the trier of fact. But those crime labs often apply thresholds to the LR values that they obtain. And so, for example, inclusionary likelihood ratios of 1,000 or under are called inconclusive, and that inculpatory evidence is not reported. Or exclusionary likelihood ratios that might be above 1 in 1,000. Those numbers are called inconclusive. They're not reported. The triers of fact never hear about this critical evidence. Information is discarded. But discarding forensic science information can open the door for legal mischief. Under the Daubert standard of admissibility for scientific evidence, error rates are a major prong. Error rates enable the reporting of all likelihood ratios. Scientists can report an error rate that provides a frequency context that makes the evidence understandable to a trier of fact. This frequency context can answer a question such as, what's the chance that someone who didn't leave their DNA, like someone on the jury, would have a match statistic as strong as the one reported against the defendant? Error rates help prevent the unscientific transformation of informative DNA evidence into inconclusive results. Results that should be reported can be reported no matter how small the match statistic is, as long as there's a contextual error rate. You can read about the fast and accurate calculation of error rates for DNA likelihood ratios in my 2018 paper published in the Helion Journal.
When we look at the definition of relevance under Federal Rules of Evidence 402, it is clear that an inconclusive forensic non-result is not admissible evidence. It has no tendency to make a fact more or less probable than it would be without the evidence. The testimony from the expert regarding the inconclusive result is that the defendant cannot be excluded, but we know also that the defendant cannot be included. The result brings us no closer to an answer on the defendant's guilt or innocence and should be excluded. As I will discuss further below, some attorneys will argue the inconclusive result is necessary to show the government's investigation was thorough and complete. But even this slightly probative value of an inconclusive forensic result is substantially outweighed by confusing the issues and misleading the jury, so it should also be excluded under Federal Rule of Evidence 403.
Here, then, is the inconclusive fallacy. It begins with unreported forensic evidence, evidence that the lab says contains no scientific information. And then an unscrupulous attorney may argue that if a person is not included, then they must be excluded, which makes no sense. There's nothing there forensical, and it implies something not.
Hold that thought, because if we go to the last page of this Payne PCA, he says, as not being excluded. Now, not being is very weird. It should just be excluded or included. So is this another way of saying, like, well, not excluded because it's one of these types of weird arguments? I don't know. This was just something that I noticed. But let's finish hearing what True Allele has to say.
Nonsensical. And yet, defendants have been and continue to be convicted by this non-existent, quote, forensic evidence, end quote.
We turn to two examples in criminal cases where this fallacy was misused. In the first instance, the prosecution of a sexual assault homicide, a criminalist testified that a mixture from at least two individuals with at least one male was detected in the sperm cell fraction from a swab from the victim's body. Due to the low-level results, the expert did not draw any conclusions. There was no likelihood or error rate calculated or presented. The expert then testified that the defendant could not be excluded from the evidence. In this case, the testimony went even a step further, where the jury was shown a chart of alleles called at each locus for the evidentiary sample compared to the defendant's DNA profile, even though the defendant was neither included or excluded, and a statistic not provided. The closing argument encouraged the jurors to rely on what they saw for themselves, that the defendant was not excluded and must be guilty. This doesn't only apply to DNA. We can take an example from where expert testimony on serology was presented. The serologist testified in a sexual assault case that testing was done to detect the presence of semen on an evidence item. The presumptive test for acid phosphatase, AP, was inconclusive because the result fell between the expected criteria of a positive and negative reaction. The expert then testified that the presumptive test for P30 was positive. Although a confirmatory microscopic examination for sperm was negative, the argument was made to the jury that the positive P30 test supported that the AP test was really positive, thus bolstering the P30 test, and that semen was actually present. This circular reasoning was admissible. It is well known that attorneys cannot make false statements as to a material fact or law. Misrepresentations include statements made with reckless disregard for the truth. It is incumbent on attorneys not to completely abdicate their understanding of forensic science to experts, and for experts to correct attorneys.
We heard that directly from Eliza Mathis. There's something in the PCA that could be considered direct disregard, reckless disregard for the truth. I don't know. And she said it has to do with the most important piece of evidence in the PCA, which could be the DNA or it could be the cell phone data. I'm not sure. But anyway, we heard that exact verbiage from Eliza Masseth. Let me go back just a little.
Understanding of forensic science to experts, and for experts to correct to a material fact or law. Misrepresentations include statements made with reckless disregard for the truth. It is incumbent on attorneys not to completely abdicate their understanding of forensic science to experts, and for experts to correct attorneys who misstate the science and not testify beyond what the science supports. But in the end, we have to rely on our judges to be responsible gatekeepers. I note the GE and Kumho cases because the Supreme Court discusses the importance of a cooperative effort between the scientific and legal community to achieve the objectives of the ascertainment of truth and the just determination of proceedings.
Right,
This
Heather?
requirement will sometimes ask judges to make subtle and sophisticated determinations about scientific methodology
That's
and its relation to the conclusion an
Oh.
expert witness seeks to offer. It is important to use motion work to educate our judges
Yeah.
about the use of this
Yes,
fallacy.
it does
In
do
practice, attorneys should file motions to exclude the presentation of inconclusive results. Keep in mind Federal Rule of Evidence 702 that controls the admissibility of expert testimony. We already talked some about relevance objections. These objections are often rebutted with arguments that proper testing must be shown, otherwise the caliber of the investigation will be challenged, as explained in Supreme Court cases like Kiles versus Whitley. But presenting evidence of complete testing is a far cry from inferring guilt from an inconclusive result, and we should still seek to limit the expert's testimony. Often it will be helpful to present our own experts to counter fallacies and admit likelihood ratios with error rates. Finally, we should file motions to preclude fallacious arguments during closings.
That's
In conclusion,
everything Bill
we've
Thompson
learned nothing
says.
comes of nothing. As zero information means zero evidence. Attorneys and experts are trying to make something from nothing when there is no scientific basis for the
Hello,
argument.
Miss Potts.
This
So good
fallacious
to
argument is
see
thwarted
you.
when we report DNA match statistics. Inconclusive evidence is inadmissible, and we know better science leads to better justice. Dr. Perlin and I encourage you to counter the inconclusive fallacy. Thank you so much for your time.
Today,
That is awesome. And so, from what we learned there, what do we think it means when they're using? Well, it's either Brett or Bill Thompson using this as not being excluded. It's worded very, very odd that it's not scientific. And as soon as I saw this video about the, something from nothing, the inconclusive type of non-forensic DNA analysis, I immediately reflected back on how this PCA is worded, and it almost looks like to me it's like it's not excluded, so it's probably a match. But I don't know. And then I also wanted to show you, and I know I made a video about this before, but I think this is very important. Now, yeah. It says here, the STR profile is likely to be seen. That's strange. So, is that another reference to, is that DNA information that has no forensic value? Because the STR profile should be visible no matter what it says. It just so happens you're making a comparison between one STR profile and the other STR profile. So when you're doing that, you're making the comparison, which Bill Thompson says in this document, that the Idaho State Lab, they did do the direct comparison between, I guess, the STR and the STR, but not the SNP. They don't do direct comparisons with the SNP. The FBI didn't compare the crime scene SNP with Brian's SNP. And so this is another one of these weird things here. That STR profile should be visible. It should be tangible. It should be a report, whether it's, you know, in paper form or if you see it on a computer encrypted document. That STR profile should be visible no matter what. Even if it's like a not match STR profile, it's still an STR profile. So this here, where it says an STR profile is more likely to be seen if given a result, like, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. And so then, if we take a look at, this is Bishop Barlow's declaration, where she says here, this reported statistic for this comparison is a likelihood ratio similar to the random match probability, which is the other statistic. So you have the likelihood ratio and the RMP. Those are the two things that Bill Thompson is confusing here. And that's why she's saying, hey, you're essentially having the prosecutor's fallacy. And so she says here, these two things, the likelihood ratio and the RMP, the random match probability, compares two competing hypotheses. The government statement is extremely misleading and is essentially the prosecutor's fallacy. The fallacy is to say that the probability is also the probability that the DNA at the crime scene came from someone other than the defendant. It does not say that the odds that the suspect contributed the evidence are 1,000 to 1. So, like we said, she's right. This statistic does not say the odds that the suspect contributed the evidence. It's saying an STR profile will be visible if given a certain result or circumstance, like unrelated. If the defendant is the source, then if an unrelated individual randomly selected from the general population is the source. So that is another one of those word salads that Bill Thompson is doing. And as soon as I saw that video earlier with the DNA information that doesn't have forensic value, that's immediately what I plugged in right here with this STR profile. But I don't know. This is just something of like how my mind works. And I thought it was so interesting that I couldn't wait to get on here and show you guys, because I don't know if anybody watches CoolherLoocher. I'll get her webpage too. She is some type of linguist, and she has broken down Bill Thompson's writing style. And I can't really describe it. You got to watch her videos. I wouldn't be able to do it justice. But what it did was, I also now understand that Bill Thompson is making these circular arguments that don't make sense. And I do believe those are there to hide the fact there isn't any evidence. And there might be also because Brian could have been found in a database. So they had 3 unknown profiles found from the actual crime scene, We have no idea what they did with them. According to the defense, they may have not have even tested them. And there are some rumors that the state has lost those. And those are actually from the crime scene. Whereas in Becca Barlow's declaration, she talks about databases, which, like, could he be randomly found in a database? Let's see here. She's talking about the database too. This is it. So the database match probability helps a jury understand the likely of a coincidental match when a database is searched, which is different than the sample rarity of a profile expressed with an RMP, a random match probability. Oh. Here, so research in the area of the impact of an IgG search on the statistical weight of a DNA comparison using standard STR DNA profiles is ongoing. The ascertainment bias, which I think we learned a little bit about that in that video we just watched, is accounted for using CODIS and standard STR testing by the use of the database match probability statistics. So there's one statistic. And this database match probability helps a jury understand the likely of a coincidental match when a database is searched, which is different than the sample rarity of a profile expressed with the random match probability. Without access to the results of the search, including how the first putative relative was identified, how many profiles were in the database searched, which databases were searched, and how the family tree was constructed along with the family tree itself, Mr. Koberger has no means to address possible significant issues with the government's evidence. Absolutely. And what database is it? I work in a database all the time. The algorithms or the structure of the database is always linking like accounts, and sometimes they're actually not alike because you have to go in there and see like what's going on. And sometimes they're not visible, and sometimes they're visible for no reason. So not only do they need to know what profiles were you looking at? How did you do your search? What family member came up first? Because I think if there's like a 1% DNA thing in IgG, then you go back 10 ancestors, 100 ancestors. And then if it's like 10%, you can go back like 200 ancestors. I don't know exactly what it is, but it does matter how far back in the tree you were, because if 200, or just say even 10, just to be safe, the 10 generations back, that's still a lot of family, and people can have cousins out here that they don't even know, they didn't even know they had. Apparently I had 11 cousins I never knew about. Well, no, it was 9 aunts and uncles, because my great grandmother was supposedly had died, but she went on to have 9 more kids. And so my grandmother Audrey, she was an only child, and all our lives we thought it was just her. But then we see my aunt did ancestry. She's like, wow, I have 9 other half brothers and sisters. So crazy. So you'll never know. You don't really, sometimes you might not know that you have family out there and even those half siblings, they would have gotten, they could have gotten one of those, what is it, the alleles or something for your base pair from the shared parent. And a lot of times when they do these searches, they could include that in the, suspect pool, even though that's like just a half relative and it's only like half the profile. Like, there's so many things that go into it. So Brian does need to look at this stuff. And there was, is it this? Something. This one here. Is Miss Pat's causing trouble? I wouldn't expect anything less. Aw, okay. So here we go. And I want to look this over because this section here is called the 2 fallacies from a document from the National Library of Medicine under the National Center of Biotechnology Information. This is called The Evolution of Forensic DNA Evidence. This is called Statistical Issues. This article, I do believe, is a little older, but I've said before, sometimes when it comes to DNA or even statistics, which we're actually looking at statistics here, it's okay sometimes to have older articles. You just have to make sure that you go ahead and research anything that has been updated, but you can still make the distinction that this information is still good. And and a lot of industries aren't like that, but I was always taught, especially because of DNA, but you have to be able to say what information has changed and what information has stayed the same. So this here, I wanted to go down here to the 2 fallacies. So the first one is the prosecutor's fallacy, also called the fallacy of transposed conditional, is to confuse 2 conditional probabilities. Let P, I guess that stands for probability, equal the probability of a match given the evidence genotype. The fallacy is to say that P is also the probability that the DNA at the crime scene came from someone other than the defendant. An likelihood ratio of 1,000 says that match is 1,000 times as probable as the evidence, and the suspect samples that share the same profile are from the same person, as if it is the samples are from different persons. It does not say the odds that the suspect contributed the DNA evidence are 1,000 to 1. It does not say the odds that are the suspect contributed evidence DNA are 1,000 to 1. To obtain such probability requires using the Bayes theorem and a prior probability that is assumed or estimated on the basis of non-DNA evidence. That's weird. As stated earlier, only if that prior probability is 1/2 will the posterior odds equal LR. Now, to me, I'm not exactly sure what this means here, but to obtain these types of probabilities, you need to rely on prerequisite information, which is the probability of the assumed estimate. So they would have done a calculation prior to. And as we know from Brett Payne, they don't usually keep their source data. They don't save their work. So not only is the state using the prosecutor's fallacy, they might not have the actual things that they need to rely on. Well, I guess it doesn't matter at this point if they're confusing two different statistics. And so the information doesn't actually say what the state is saying it's saying. But if you look here, it does not say that the odds that the suspect contributed the DNA evidence are 1,000 to 1. And in one of those videos that we watched, sometimes when that happens, and I don't think the defense would bring this up if this weren't the case, that actually the DNA evidence is exculpatory. Otherwise, I don't think that they would highlight directly that, okay, yeah, they're using the prosecutor's fallacy, but the DNA is still inculpatory. So I think the argument here is, yeah, the state's using the prosecutor's fallacy. They're confusing two things. So what they're saying is not accurate. And actually, the DNA evidence says something different. And if you see the sentence here, it is the same here. It does not say the odds that the suspect contributed the evidence are 1,000 to 1. So I found the same exact sentence in two different documents. The defense does have 5 different DNA samples. I'm not surprised. It came from a party house. In my opinion, it should have been a mixture because of the proximities of the bodies. Oh my gosh, hello, David Bird. Welcome. There is also a probability that it was planted, right? Also, if they make it seem like it's a pristine, brand new sheath, so brand new that they're like, oh, we gotta look on Amazon to see if somebody bought it. Excuse me. So does that mean there wasn't any blood DNA on it? And so if there wasn't any blood or DNA on it, and the only thing on there was the 20 skin cells on the little brass button snap, well then it wasn't there during the altercation. It had to have been placed afterward if it was completely clean. So that's very strange. To be able to fit the situation, it should match the environment. And the environment, from what we hear, was disturbed, and there should be body fluids, blood splatter. And so it should match being disturbed, probably have some blood splatter on it. Yeah, and we don't really know where it was found because isn't it stated by 3 different people from the state? It was in 3 different places. Kane, welcome, Kane. Yeah, so if any of you, I'm gonna go out to dinner shortly, but if any of you can help me understand why the state would use these types of circular arguments, especially one that says the STR profile is likely to be seen if, but the STR profile should be visible no matter what it says. So where is the STR profile they used to compare to anything? Because if the defense is saying, okay, state, you're doing the prosecutor's fallacy, you are confusing things, and what you're stating is not actually what the information says, then what? I don't know. Anybody? Oh, hello, Christy. Christy Nevada. Hello, Kane. Reckless disregard for the truth is what AT needs to prove for her Frank's mission. I think she's got plenty. I mean, I've never seen anything written. The STR profile is likely to be seen. That doesn't seem right. Yeah. Oh, and there was one thing I forgot to show you from my last live when I was going over. I'm going to go over this last little bit to kind of go over what I talked to last time, and then I'm going to go that I was talking about the paint epoxy that goes over the brass for the metal snap. Many manufacturers are using these types of, whether it's paint, a powder epoxy paint, a film, something like that, so that here we go. So on the knife snap, I do believe that the K-bar does have a fire retardant over the brass, but what I was saying is that type of fire retardant, what they did with the nanoparticles is they took the properties that metal has, and so that it will still be antimicrobial. And so on the knife sheath, there could be this epoxy paint, and then the brass. And either way, whether it's a brass material or it does have this fire retardant on it, both of those things are antimicrobial, and the DNA should not have been, or it should be extremely degraded, or not extremely, but it should be degraded from those things. And what I was back over here, and I wanted to go over Are Viruses Alive? This is from Harvard, the Harvard Museum of Science and Culture. I'll have to add this to the link in the comment section down below. So from the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, they want to talk about the world of viruses. And down here, I want to highlight that Are Viruses Alive? Viruses occupy space on the tree of life that blurs the line between existence and non-existence. Life is generally defined as an organism that can live and reproduce autonomously, using its own energy-producing biological mechanisms. Viruses, on the other hand, are essentially parasites. In order to multiply, must harness a host cell replication mechanisms because they are unable to do any of this on their own. Some argue that they are not among the living. However, other scientists suggest that they become viruses. That because viruses are made up of the same building blocks of life, DNA and RNA. They are on the verge of life. Though that's not my point. My point is that their mode of transportation is DNA, whether it's theirs or they're hopping a ride on ours. And we know from viruses like the common cold or the flu, somebody's sneezing, you can get sick. Somebody's walking by, you can have their trace DNA flakes on you. All you gotta do is like walk by. So we have to start thinking of this trace DNA like the common cold. So, okay, even if Brian's DNA, his 20 skin cells are, I think, what, Heather, did you say there were 9? Somebody, or was it Tara? Tara may have said it was 9. No, Tara didn't do that. I don't know. Anyway, it's like, well, just because that person has a cold and that person over there doesn't have a cold, but like there's skin on a knife sheath. I don't know. Just so yes, the viruses' mode of transportation is DNA. They have their own and they can hijack ours. So think of trace DNA like a virus or the common cold. And let's see. And that to find out if there was enamel on the snap of the knife sheath, Chloe Penny had asked me to look into it, and Chloe Penny has been on this brass DNA for so long. She was on it way before I posted that in February of 24. Yeah, very easily transfer. So I wanted to add that little addendum to and then I don't know if any of you missed this. Real quick before I go. So they're trying to make epoxy powder paints or paints antimicrobial, and they manufacturers are trying to put them to prevent frequently touched surfaces from serving as reservoirs for the spread of viruses or disease. And so manufacturers are coating anything from face masks, supermarket trolleys, door handles, push bars, passenger supports in buses and trains, touch screens, and computer mice installed at public places, electronic power switchboards, toilet seats, tables, chairs, contact surfaces. So some of these contact surfaces can have an epoxy powder paint film fire retardant type antibacterial coating that is made up of copper, zinc, which makes brass. So if you want to learn more about brass and the epoxy or paint fire retardant coatings, watch the live from last week. So that's what we're looking at right here. There should be an epoxy paint of some sort on that button, but it will also reflect or mimic the qualities of brass. So either way, if it's brass not or brass under the epoxy coating, it's still antibacterial, which will kill the DNA or degrade it. It'll cause damage. So not only would it be trace DNA, it would be damaged. Okay, everybody, thank you for stopping by today. I wanted to get you a little bit more about those circular reasonings of Bill Thompson and how he likes to make something out of nothing. And that always just means you have nothing. But you all have a great week. Hopefully we'll be hearing lots more for Thursday. I'm looking forward to it. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.